Russia is the world's largest country, and the Kremlin is the political heart of Russia. For centuries, behind its walls, strong, secretive, and sometimes evil men have dominated this country and often terrified the outside world. But over the last 20 years, Russia has undergone another revolution. For the last 6 years, one man has been in charge of this country, Vladimir Putin. And the Kremlin machine has tried to sell him to the West as a liberal democrat, while at the same time selling him to the Russians as the hard man their country needs. But in less than 2 years, Putin must leave office. So what's life like inside the Kremlin as one presidency nears its end and an unknown future looms? "25 years ago, Russia was communist. The leader was an ex-KGB man, Yuri Andropov, and Moscow had been dubbed the capital of the evil empire. And the one place few, if any, outsiders ever got near was the political heart of this country, the Kremlin. Although much has changed in 20 years, including the end of communist rule here, it's still difficult to get to the other side of these walls. Dimitri Peskov works in the Kremlin. He's officially first deputy to the presidential press secretary. Unofficially, he's known as the Kremlin's master of spin. His pay grade entitles him to an official ride to work every morning through Moscow's legendary traffic. After an hour's commute, Peskov finally arrives inside the Kremlin.
When I was a kid, when I was going to school, I mean, all this Kremlin and actually government, leadership of the country, it was something so far away that, for example, you know that Australia exists. I've never been there, but I believe that it exists. But it's so far away that I'm never thinking about it like something that lies very close to me. So the same attitude was towards the Kremlin. But at the same time, well, the Red Square that is here, it's a very special place for all Russians. The stone on this Red Square have seen so many leaders, have seen so many victories, so many disgrace, you say? Yeah. Everything was here. Everything was here. This Red Square witnessed the whole history of this country. And when I was a child, when we came here, it was a feeling of meeting something special, meeting something great, meeting the history itself of this country. When I spent 6 years in this office, I'm sometimes complaining that unfortunately this job made it impossible for me to feel such feelings again.
The job of Dimitri Peskov and his team at the press department is regarded as crucial to the presidency of Vladimir Putin. In a society where the press is much freer than it was, the image of the president is said to be presented both at home and abroad much more carefully than it used to be under the Soviet regime. Although, like all spin doctors, Dimitri insists he's just presenting the truth.
Our job is to ensure that what our president does is highlighted objectively. Western media are not so willing to be objective in focusing on Russia, and focusing on Russian president. He's being blamed for everything. And as if he's not the man who cares about the interests of this country, about the national interests of Russia. He's being blamed for authoritarian regime, while he just insists on putting things back to order in this country.
Dimitri Peskov's office is in Kremlin building number 14. the offices of the presidential administration. That, and the Senate building, the office of the president himself, make the Kremlin the most important piece of real estate in Russia. But the area within the 1.5 miles of walls that surround the Kremlin was originally just the tiny walled city of medieval Moscow. Now there are museums, concert halls and cathedrals that you can visit as a tourist. But there are not that many tourists here when the temperature is minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The Kremlin Grand Palace is where the most important ceremonies are held. The biggest rooms here date back to the great imperial Tsars of the 19th century. The man who's responsible for making sure that they're ready for any event has a job description that harks back to the Soviet era. He is the foreman of all the electricians, Gennady Snegiryov. Gennady joined the Kremlin staff 33 years ago, straight from the army, and has served under 6 Russian leaders.
Brezhnev, Chernenko,
Chernenko, Andropov, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Who are the most fun, the jolliest?
In my opinion, probably the jolliest, when I think about it, was Boris Yeltsin
Борис Николаевич и Леонид Ильича.
and Leonid Brezhnev.
Как-то они мне запомнились
That's how I remember them.
в таком, так сказать...
Did you ever meet them personally?
Нет, я
No, I've never met them face to face. Basically, they don't know who I am.
практически не знаю, кто я такой есть.
I always tried to keep my distance. And most importantly, I know my job
Близко. Я все же знаю свою работу. Прежде всего,
and my place.
и свое место. Включаем 2 торшера, включаем 2 люстры.
Gennady's place may be the Grand Palace, but the most important part of it, for him, is not that grand at all.
Sometimes, when I'm feeling bad, like not long ago my mother died, I automatically come to the Chain Palace. And here, maybe because of the icons, maybe because of the smell of the place, here I feel peaceful.
These are the private rooms of the very first of the Romanov Tsars from the early 17th century.
Время останавливается.
Time stops here.
Могу просто сидеть.
Here I can just sit and enjoy my freedom. Here I can think whatever I want.
Что хочу, да?
In fact, the Kremlin Grand Palace is about to be used for a presidential event. Putin will be coming here for a formal meeting with 9 new ambassadors to the Russian Federation. Although this is not a public event, it is covered by the press. But they are controlled. A small area on the far side of the hall has been cordoned off for them.
Обязательно включаем люстры Андреевского зала.
Putin's official photographer and video cameraman get the best access, but they've arrived slightly late.
Прокуратуре. Опа, там совещание было.
The video cameraman is complaining that his equipment seems to be suffering from the extreme cold outside. The president, the leader of the largest country in the world, makes his entrance. President Putin is not a tall man, but he is the most important and perhaps the most extraordinary character working within the Kremlin. And a Russian president probably has more power, personally, in his hands than any of the leaders in the West. Vladimir Putin was initially appointed to the presidency rather than elected. In 1999, allegations of corruption, poor health and fading popularity forced President Yeltsin to appoint a successor. So the relatively unknown Vladimir Putin came to power before an election could be called. It wasn't until March 2000 that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was finally elected to be the leader of the world's largest country. But according to the new constitution of the Russian Federation, he can only serve 2 terms. So, in 2008, Putin must relinquish the presidency. Even though Putin is the president, he sometimes has to wait. Formal events like these are organised by the Kremlin's protocol department, and they run on a strict timetable. They're a diplomatic necessity, and if this is anything to go by, they are, frankly, a bit dull. Not surprisingly, the president's own official photographer and cameraman are allowed to get closer to him than anyone else. They snap away, but Vladimir Rodionov says it's not what he most likes to do.
It was just a protocol meeting and they're not that interesting. Can't get very much there.
What are your favourite moments? What are the best times for you to be able to do your work?
My favourite moments are the informal moments, like when the president's on holiday. This was an interesting trip. We were rafting down a mountain river on inflatable boats. Everyone was in the right gear and the president was paddling. In fact, the only person who wasn't paddling was me, because I was holding the camera. This is one of my personal favourites. I would say it's the best one, this one. I took it on our trip to the Northern Fleet, to a submarine. It was my first time ever on a submarine.
These photographs seem to reveal contradictions about President Putin's image. He's often portrayed as the authoritarian leader, but also as a healthy outdoorsman, and sometimes as the warm man of the people. Does he ever say that there are photographs of yours that he particularly likes or doesn't like?
No, we've never even talked about it, really. He never says if a shot is good or bad. Actually, we do give him the pictures as mementos, but he never expresses an opinion. Maybe when he's at home with his family, he has a look at them and says something, but I wouldn't know about that.
By midnight, the Kremlin seems quiet. In what was the workers' state, most of the workers have gone home, and that includes the president. The office corridors are deserted, but some of the president's staff are still at work. Larissa and Alexandra are going through the first editions of tomorrow's papers. They'll take only the most significant stories to produce the press digest, sent first thing in the morning to all the most important people in the Kremlin, including the president. Newspaper publication has boomed in post-Soviet Russia. There are still pro-government papers and old-style communist papers like Pravda, but there are also quite strident anti-Putin papers. In fact, there are even tabloids, complete with pin-ups and celebrity gossip. But Larissa doesn't even bother to look at them when taking the political temperature.
I'll put this article in the digest. It's about the political future after 2008.
Oh, and about who'll be president?
Yes, as usual, lots of different opinions.
No newspaper under the Soviet system would ever have dared speculate about who would be the next president. Soviet leaders, with very few exceptions, ruled for life. But since Putin must hand over the presidency to someone else by 2008, the newspapers are filled with political speculations. Russians have always been preoccupied about the future. Now it seems more than ever. And Larissa takes a moment to read everyone's horoscopes.
I could tell you your horoscope if you like.
Okay, I'm Leo.
You're Leo? Right. You'll have great success in business and with family and friends. It's a very good day for relationships.
And you?
Me?
You're?
I'm Pisces. I need to be very careful with authority and with leaders.
Although the papers are happy to speculate, no one inside the Kremlin can quite bring themselves to discuss who will be the next president. There was a very different climate in Red Square on New Year's Eve 1992, when Russians celebrated the final collapse of communism. But the optimism was short-lived, and Russia's political future now is difficult to predict. After spending 80 years in the brutal nursery of Soviet communism, Russian democracy is still in its infancy. The lawlessness and economic chaos of the last 10 years have meant more uncertainty and poverty for the average Russian. Real wealth only to a very few. When Putin took power, he promised a return to law and order. Music to the ears of many Russians who still crave an authoritarian leader. In that way, Putin's strong-man approach is sometimes indistinguishable from that of Soviet-era leaders, but with an important difference. Unless he tears up the constitution, he can't be a candidate at the next presidential election. Despite reports that the Russian media are more or less state-controlled, some stories do emerge on Russian TV news that don't reflect well upon the state. This breaking news story is about the brutal treatment of a soldier in a town called Chelyabinsk. The young man was badly beaten and went without medical treatment for so long that gangrene set in. The draftee eventually had to have both legs and his genital organs amputated. As part of his democratization of the country, Putin is reportedly eager to abolish the draft and have an all-volunteer army. But the Chelyabinsk story works against that agenda. The soldiers in the ceremonial presidential regiment are just draftees, but they're some of the lucky ones. It's considered a great honor to be selected.
I was training to be a teacher when I was called up. 3 months before I joined up, I was asked if I wanted to join the presidential regiment.
Did you have a choice?
Oh yes, but I would still have had to join the army anyway. From my town there were about 10 candidates, and only 4 got chosen.
Russia is a country that takes great pride in its military history and tradition. Since the fall of communism, the ceremonial military guards have gone from Lenin's tomb in Red Square. But Russia's role in what we call the Second World War, but they call the Great Patriotic War, is still revered. Standing guard over the tomb of the unknown soldier is one of the more public duties of the presidential regiment. And like all of them, Konstantin, one of the guards, says he's proud to do it.
It's just such a big responsibility. One day I'll be able to bring my kids here and say, I stood guard there.
The soldiers stand guard for a full hour, whatever the weather. It may be a great honor, but young men are young men, and even at moments like these, their minds tend to wander.
Girls give you their telephone numbers.
How? How do they do it?
They just do.
They call out the numbers and you remember them, or they write them down, you can see them. You can't talk to them, but you can watch. You can watch your post and still look around. A lot of things like that have happened.
So it's a good way of picking up girls then?
I've been here about 2 years, and there were occasions when guys met girls that way, and after their term of service was over, they got married.
Filming is not allowed inside the Kremlin, just as it wouldn't be inside the White House without being accompanied. And our minder is Yuri Koritsky, a member of Dimitri Peskov's staff. Besides minding film crews, Yuri's also doing much of the planning for President Putin's upcoming state visit to Spain. Yuri is organizing a meeting between the president and a few selected members of the Spanish press before Putin actually goes to Spain. Yuri's got to find the right Kremlin location for the event.
Алло, Наталья Владимировна? День добрый, Корицкий Юрий, пресс-служба президента. Наталья Владимировна, в принципе, на данный момент библиотека рассматривается как возможное место проведения интервью, да, и, скорее всего, там оно и состоится. На данный момент в 18:00 у нас время.
The presidential library, where the meeting between the president and the journalists is now scheduled to take place, is in the building next door, where the president's office is. It's the nearest thing in the Kremlin to the west wing of the White House. The presidential library itself is built for show rather than study. Many of its books are simply presents sent to the president.
I wanted to show you a present for the president from Henry Kissinger. It's signed.
So it's a personal gift?
Yes, see here, signed to the president from Henry Kissinger.
There is one book here that's not a lot older than the Henry Kissinger book, but historically it's a lot more interesting. It's the new constitution of the Russian Federation.
This is the special inauguration copy of the Constitution. Has the emblem of the Russian Federation.
It's on this book that the president must swear his oath of allegiance. So far, it's only been used 3 times, once by Yeltsin and twice by Putin. Although the Constitution does give the president enormous power, it's only for a limited time. And for Putin, that time is beginning to run out.
This is our world, and it speaks to us every day. Are you listening?
It's Monday morning. Yuri Koritsky, the fixer, is on his way to work at the Kremlin. Today is the day of President Putin's meeting with the Spanish journalists in the presidential library, and it'll be Yuri's responsibility to organize it. A good deal lower down the political food chain than his boss Peskov, Yuri has to drive himself to work. Yuri and others descend on the library to make it ready for the event. Putin's Kremlin wants to project an image of a 21st century Russia that's open to the international media. Librarian Natalia will just have to put up with her usually quiet space being invaded.
Сейчас точно не буду работать, да?
Точно, 100%.
Сейчас пока не понятно по задержке. Сейчас будем знать, тогда уже будем. Сейчас главное, видите, сейчас Лена посмотрит по гриму, да, по свету. Соответственно, сейчас у тебя Песков пытается дозвониться. Я думаю, я на самом деле хотел бы, чтобы он подошел, например, минут через 10, да?
Dimitri Peskov, Yuri's boss and the Kremlin's chief spin doctor, arrives in the presidential library. He has to tell the journalists that the president will be late, a regular feature of the presidential schedule, it seems.
Прежде всего, мы рады вас здесь приветствовать. Скорее всего, у нас будет небольшая задержка по времени. Мы думаем, что президент ближе к 7, наверное, потому что у него идет обычный рабочий график. Говорит через переводчика, перевод будет последовательным.
As the time for the presidential arrival gets closer, the tension and the excitement in the room mount.
During the meeting, where will you be?
Back there, behind the shells.
What, hiding?
Yes, hiding. I don't come out. It's not allowed.
On his cousin? Won't he say hello?
No, he won't. That doesn't happen.
That's a shame.
Yes, I think so too.
But you've probably met him hundreds of times.
Well, only at events like this.
But not face to face?
No, never.
Never?
No, never.
That's a shame. Wouldn't you like to?
Yes, I'd love to, but...
2 hours behind schedule, the president finally arrives. This is one of the relatively rare occasions when members of the press can meet with the president, so the questions are expected to focus on issues directly related to the agenda. On this occasion, it's the forthcoming state visit to Spain. And on the whole, they do. Sitting on the right hand of the president, at the very top of the Kremlin hierarchy, is Alexei Gromov, the press secretary. Gromov is both Peskov and Yuri's boss. His presence normally ensures that everything goes according to plan. But it doesn't. One of the Spanish journalists departs completely from the agenda and confronts Putin about Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of Russia's new billionaires who was recently tried on fraud and tax evasion charges. He was sent to jail in Siberia and has just been put in solitary confinement.
Some people say that what's happening to Khodorkovsky is all part of a vendetta against him. Is this routine behaviour, or is it a special case?
Если по-честному, я даже не знаю сейчас, о чем вы говорите. Потому что я знаю, что состоялось решение, есть обвинительный приговор суда, что Ходорковский осужден, находится в местах лишения свободы.
As far as I understand it, his lawyers said he was put in solitary confinement for possessing a document, some official document, about his legal rights, not to mention the fact that he's been sent to a prison in Chita, which is a long way from his home.
Тюрьма – это не дом отдыха. Посылают туда, куда считают нужным. То, что он в карцере оказался, я, откровенно говоря, первый раз слышу от вас.
Newspapers have written about it, his lawyers have written about it. I read about it in your newspapers.
Да-да-да, это вот хорошо, что у нас все пишут, но дело в том, что я все читать не успеваю. Но поскольку вы обратили мое внимание на это, я обязательно у министра юстиции спрошу, что там происходит. Куда вы там направили в карцер и за что?
In Russia, whatever the president does is news, and today's events are no exception. But on the state-controlled television channel, no mention is made of the Spanish journalist challenging the president about Khodorkovsky. But there is another breaking news story that gets a lot of attention. 3 British diplomats have been accused of being spies. Russian television even shows footage of the imitation rock they used to transmit information. First thing in the morning, Peskov's assistants are swamped with stories of British spies as they check the papers.
Что ты там написано, английский шпион, английский шпион?
Во всех газетах.
Да.
Да.
Дураки.
Бывает.
Dimitri Peskov's job today will be to manage the inevitable barrage of calls from journalists after last night's TV coverage of the spy story.
It was a very funny pictures. And the pictures, it's very hard to deny. It's very hard to deny, yeah. But it's very interesting. The technology itself is...
The presidential administration is publicly taking the position that this is a security issue and they don't need to comment. But there's a complicating factor. The story also claims that the British spies were involved in the financing of a Russian pro-democracy group. Peskov knows that the Putin administration doesn't want to seem overly critical of these groups for political reasons, so he's arranging for other people, not from the Kremlin, to comment.
This is actually, I'm too lazy to turn it. And it's very bad to use mobile phone while you have this at hand. This is what I'm doing wrong, actually. And smoking. Да, привет. Ты на мероприятии? Ты знаешь чего? Скажи мне, кто-нибудь из палаты сможет покомментировать вот эту ситуацию с НПО, которые деньги получили?
It's hard to follow the details, but the spin Peskov seems to be creating is that the president is not blaming the pro-democracy group for their involvement with the spy scandal. Unofficially, however, the groups themselves are now well aware that the Kremlin's keeping an eye on them. Many observers speculate that this was why the story was leaked in the first place.
Вдвоем будут вас сегодня мучить. Окей? Все, спасибо. Спасибо.
A few phone calls later, Peskov can inform his assistant that they've got the right people to put out the right message without the Kremlin appearing to be directly involved. He's far too diplomatic to ask us not to film this, but he certainly does what he can to prevent us from hearing what he's saying.
Он два тезиса будет озвучивать. Первый — это то, что, собственно, на НПО никто не наезжает. Если естественно поступали, то они должны декларировать.
Ну да, это что, страшно?
Он готов, он ждет.
Да, ладно.
The president arrives for work. Today, he'll be more concerned with internal politics than with spy stories. He's chairing his weekly cabinet meeting, and this week he'll need to deal with the incident at the Chelyabinsk army barracks where a soldier was brutally beaten. This is the Security Council office. It's the room in which the president tells his ministers what he wants and in which they have to report back to him. Defense Minister Sergei Ivanov is a rising star in the government. He's considered to be one of the serious contenders for the presidency after 2008, and his colleagues treat him with cautious respect. As Defense Minister, Ivanov will obviously be involved in any exchange with the president on the Chelyabinsk issue. 20 years ago, no foreigner would have been allowed to film anywhere near here. For 100 years, Russian leaders have been walking down these corridors, from Lenin and Stalin through to Yeltsin, and now Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. These televised cabinet meetings are an opportunity for the president to demonstrate that he's involved with the day-to-day government of his ministers. And today the television audience will expect the president to show that he knows about the brutal beating of a draftee and that he's expecting the defense minister Sergei Ivanov to take action.
Прошу Министерство обороны оказать всяческое содействие Генеральной прокуратуре в расследовании, полном расследовании этого уголовного. В том числе и те,
Sergei Ivanov, like anyone around this table, must know that his political future and any chance of becoming president himself will depend upon Putin's opinion of him, not the electorate's. Russia is a managed democracy, and in a managed democracy, the president leads, while the state tries to educate the electorate to a level at which it can be trusted to make the right choices. And so it really will be up to President Putin to select a preferred candidate for the presidency from amongst those closest to him, and to suggest that candidate to the people. It's a form of democracy that Dimitri Peskov, as Kremlin's spin doctor, is quite used to defending.
I'm convinced that we cannot speak about a pure democracy. Russia cannot have the same democracy like the United States. And it's obvious. And we cannot think like Americans or like British. We cannot think like French. We can only think and live like Russians. If it is not alike, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is wrong.
Despite that, Putin has adopted what appears to be a very Western tradition, the press conference. But of course here it's a bit different. And once a year he holds a live 2-hour press conference with 1,000 members of the Russian press and foreign journalists. Everyone wants to attend. Those who have Peskov's cell phone number are continually interrupting him to request access.
Hi Dana, how are you doing? So what's up? Just ask your guys to contact our accreditation department and they will do all the formalities.
It's 4 days before the event, but just down the corridor from Peskov's office, workers are already making preparations.
Сегодня первый день подготовки, поэтому...
Такую развалочку у нас сегодня происходит.
И поэтому не все готово.
Сегодня нет, все готово, надо думать. Есть время подумать, скажем так.
Катки не поджаривают пока.
Это русский ответ.
Да.
For the press department and for Dimitri Peskov, this conference will be one of the major events of the Russian political calendar.
It's a huge one. Just imagine, it's about 1,000 journalists. I cannot recall any other country, any other president in the world who has ever had such a press conference.
How do you orchestrate who gets to ask a question, who doesn't get to ask a question?
Well, it's never orchestrated.
No, but...
well, of course there are sensitivities and, well, of course, well, you can predict what is going to be asked by foreign media. Gromov, the press secretary, knows personally lots of journalists. And of course he knows that certain journalists from federal TV channels, he knows some foreign journalists. From that point of view, he can orchestrate.
It's a sign of the times, perhaps, that the night before the conference, Russian TV runs an animation that satirizes the president's preparations for the event. This is a caricature of the defense minister Ivanov, rehearsing Putin in a question about the Chelyabinsk incident. Reports are that Putin doesn't really approve of this cartoon, but the TV channel continues to run it anyway, although now they never actually show his face.
Вот тут написано, что тот ужасный случай в Челябинске находится в поле зрения руководства министра обороны. Понял? Ну, находится. Отлично. Значит, это тоже ответили. Так, следующий вопрос. Брателло.
Tomorrow, President Putin will face the questions for real.
How well do you know your history? What if what we were taught was wrong? Follow a team of forensic experts as they investigate the most controversial events of our past.
We're left with the fact that we don't know what happened.
Whether a politically motivated lie or a disturbing crime, they will stop at nothing to reveal the truth.
30% of that image is retouched.
Unsolved History, Saturday at 10. Only on the Discovery Times channel.
It's 7 o'clock on the morning of the press conference, and the temperature in Red Square is -4 degrees. The journalists who've managed to get accreditation start arriving at the Kremlin. It'll take 5 hours to get them all through the rigorous security procedures. In the conference chamber, the final preparations are being made. Kremlin pencils are being handed out. Translation headsets are being unlocked from their armrests, and the presidential microphones are being plugged in. Downstairs, the press are finally trickling into the warmth of the building. The press conference starts at 12 o'clock and will be televised live for 2 hours to a potential audience of more than 100 million. The doors of the conference room itself open 2 hours before the event begins, and the early cameraman catches the best tripod position. Every single journalist here knows that this may be the one opportunity in the year for them to ask the president a question. They also seem to believe that renewing any acquaintance they may have with Peskov or with the press secretary Gromov may make all the difference between success and failure.
I called the Kremlin and asked, how do we ask a question? They just said, put your hand up, and if you're lucky, you'll be chosen. I don't know whether questions are selected in advance in secret. I don't know.
So does a lot depend on how well you know Gromov, then?
I hope that by knowing Gromov, and Gromov at least recognises me, perhaps that'll help him recognise my hand. I don't know.
When a live television audience is waiting, even a president with a reputation for being late turns up on time.
Добрый день, уважаемые дамы и господа. Спасибо за теплый прием. Насколько мне известно, рекордное количество журналистов аккредитовано на сегодняшнем мероприятии.
This appears to be a slightly different Putin. He seems almost excited, or perhaps he's nervous at the prospect of answering journalists' questions in front of a live TV audience for at least 2 hours without the safety net of a teleprompter or even the benefit of notes. But most Russian journalists still seem slightly stuck in a Soviet time warp. They treat their president with greater respect, diffidence, even fear than Western journalists treat their leaders.
Владимир Владимирович, на прошлой пресс-конференции мы с вами затронули вопрос о трудностях приватизации садовых огородных участков.
Скажите, пожалуйста, чем руководствовалась Россия при выборе приоритетных направлений в вступлении «восьмерки»?
У меня вопрос о российско-украинских отношениях в газовой сфере. Кажется, в начале года...
Some of the questions bring out a side of Putin not usually seen.
Вот, Владимир Владимирович, я, честно говоря, ехала сюда, я тоже хотела задать очень серьезные и умные вопросы, но на третьем часу нашей беседы я понимаю, что я должна просто взять себя в руки и от лица всех блондинок в этом зале просто задать такой совершенно, может быть, глупый и смешной вопрос. Вот чем вы пользуетесь для того, чтобы так хорошо выглядеть? Пользуетесь ли вы какими-то специальными средствами, восстанавливающими молодость и красоту? Спасибо.
Если к специальным средствам относить спиртные напитки, то я не пользуюсь. Наркотики вообще никогда не употреблял, даже не пробовал. Никогда не курил. Люблю спорт. Вот, пожалуй, и много работаю. В вашем лице всем блондинкам большой привет.
Здравствуйте, Барбара Владарчик, польское телевидение. Мои коллеги сказали, что я не смогу задать вопрос. Жалко, что с ними не поспорила. Сказали, конечно,
жалко, да. Могли бы выиграть и с нами поделиться.
Да.
Кондратьев, телекомпания НТВ. Владимир Владимирович, вы уже несколько раз...
A journalist from one of the main Russian TV channels finally asks the big question. Has Putin already chosen his successor, or is there a chance that a realistic presidential candidate will emerge from the political parties?
Вы уже сделали этот выбор? Определили вы, кто может стать таким преемником? Спасибо.
У нас много людей в России, очень много, которые могли бы возглавить страну. И окончательный ответ по этому поводу может дать только избиратель, российский народ, гражданин Российской Федерации.
Putin effectively sidesteps the issue of who he'll select as his successor, but he makes it clear that he doesn't want to see any great change from his style of leadership. He judges his own presidential legacy as successful.
Всегда хочется большего. Я вспоминаю конец 1999 года и сегодняшнее состояние и экономики, и государственности, и социальной сферы. Очень большая разница. И это разница со знаком плюс. Но, конечно, еще очень много проблем. И надеюсь на то, что мы будем, двигаясь дальше таким же образом, также эффективно подходить к их решению.
The live television coverage of the conference ended after 2 hours, But Putin carried on answering questions for a further hour and a half before the conference finally concluded. It was an organizational success by Dimitri Peskov's team and an impressive performance from a man who's obviously quite comfortable with his role as president of the world's largest country. But can he achieve what he's set out to do? Russia has certainly changed under the Putin presidency, but he and his team have less than 2 years to finish the job of preparing the world's largest country for a leading role in the 21st century before a new administration comes in and someone else takes over the most important job inside the Kremlin.